I want to talk for a few moments about the idea of justice, equity, human rights, human law, how we live together as a people, and how we live together as a society, especially in light of the upcoming election in Alberta. We have a race between the United Conservative Party and the NDP Party, and it's easy to get caught up in the moment and to focus on what's happening in the moment, but it's also a good idea to kind of step back and look in at what's going on from the outside. So I want to start with the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was drawn up in the 1100s. The Magna Carta was presented by the princes and by the priests or the pastors of England to the King of England in the 1100s. And basically what the Magna Carta was it was a series of rights, it was a series of laws based on timeless principles, and it was presented to the king, who had been acting in a tyrannical way, and it was presented to the king as something that stands above the king, saying, these are things that you cannot take away from us. We still respect and we honor you as the king, but we need something in order to check tyranny. So it basically presented the idea that the king was under the law. He was bound by the law. I would argue that this is the basis for constitutional law, that the king is under the law, that any leader is under the law. So you have that in the 1100s. I believe that biblical Christianity in ways affects the many other nations, but there you see a very specific example of how the salt and light of the gospel of Christians thinking in Christian ways begins to affect the whole of a country as it begins to take root in the country. Now in the 1500s you have the Reformation, and as the Reformation happens, Christians are trying to find protection from persecution. And so you have greater thought and reflection that happens on the relationship between the church and the state, the separation of church and state, but not the total division of church and state. And you start seeing state churches develop in different countries. You start seeing work done on the limits of human authority. For example, I believe Bucer did some work on it. With the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France, there was a lot more reflection that happened among Christians on the limits of human authority. Johannes Althusius was a lawyer in Germany following the time of the Reformation, and a little bit longer of a ways after. Johannes Althusius was a German Calvinistic lawyer, and he does a lot of reflection on tyranny, on human rights, on the basis for human law. He does a lot of amazing work on that. You have Samuel Rutherford in England, who writes a book called Lex Rex, The King and the Law, or The King Under the Law. It's important work that also links back to the Magna Carta. These are all very, very important things that happen as we see a development of human law, ideas for justice and equity in nations. But now there's a very important thing that happens and that affects us where we are today. You have the American Revolution that happened in the late 1700s, and then you have the French Revolution that happened in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Now these are two very different revolutions. The American Revolution was based on a constitution. The American Revolution had a lot of Calvinistic pastors who supported the foundation of this new country. It had a lot of Christian influences. It developed biblical standards for law. It was a revolution against tyranny from a foreign nation that was not giving liberty to the colonies. And so it was a revolution against that, and it was an answer to that in the sense that it called for principles of law, rights and freedoms under which people could live and live freely. Conversely to that, you have the French Revolution that happened. Again, it was a revolution against authority, but it was done in a very different way. The primary slogan of the French Revolution was the will of the people, and it was repeated over and over and over again. It was a rejection of God. It was a rejection of biblical law. It was, I would argue, a total deviation away from the Western foundations for law. And you see that in the horrors of the French Revolution. You see that in the guillotine. You see that in the sense that there are not timeless principles for human rights based on an objective reality outside of oneself, but that human rights are based on the will of the people, the majority, and you see that will of the majority in the fact that the frequency of the use of the guillotine on the minority. It was a brutal time. So these are two very different countries. Now I want to reflect on these two revolutions in light of where we are in Canada today. Now, as a Canadian nation, we, like the United States of America, stem from British rule. Now, our separation from Britain happened in the late 1800s, and it happened in a much, much more peaceful way than the American Revolution happened. As a Canadian nation, we have inherited many of the structures of British law, including the Magna Carta, by the way. We have inherited parliaments. We still have the monarch as a type of figurehead. Canada is part of the Commonwealth, whereas the United States is not. So in many ways, we differ from America. But we also differ very much from the French Revolution. We do not have the French Revolutionary heritage. We have a heritage of constitutional law that stems from Britain. We have our differences from the States in the sense that we still recognize the monarchy. We still have that parliamentary system. That's the way in which we differ from the States. But we still have that idea of constitutional law in our nation. Now what's interesting is that in the last 50 years we've seen a drift more in the direction of the principles of the French Revolution. The French revolutionary principles seem to be affecting our nation deeply, especially with the leadership of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Many have argued, and I would agree with this, that the foundation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms led in this direction, where the freedoms are not based on timeless principles necessarily, but are more based on democratic ideals. It's interesting that in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it does begin, though, with the idea of the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Now, people will say that that's vague, but it still shows that there's a continuing influence of the foundation of our nation. And the foundation of our nation is very much Christian indeed. You look at the motto for our nation, Amare usque ad mare, that comes from Psalm 72, which talks about the rule of Christ from sea to sea. You also have Bible verses written all over the Peace Tower. Now, our current Prime Minister is trying to erase some of those symbols, not those symbols in particular, but other symbols that have been passed on through our national symbols. But yet, you still see that foundation of the nation that's been grounded in constitutional law, even as we drift away from it increasingly. Now, what does this have to do with the Alberta election? I'm not convinced that either leader, Rachel Notley or Danielle Smith, have a clear idea of the grounding of Canada in constitutional law. And so in that ways, there's a possibility of drifting in the direction of French revolutionary principles. Even if one might give us more freedom than the other, yet there is still that tension that we're looking at today. So it's something to reflect on for Christians as we communicate with our elected officials in the coming years, as we talk to them, as we appeal to them for just rule in our society, that we not just be speaking as people who are saying, well, you should do this because I really want you to do this. Because if you're in the minority, they're probably not going to listen to you anyway, because our leaders are going to lead based off of the majority who are going to elect them, at least largely speaking. So there needs to be some sort of law outside of ourselves, some sort of higher law, the reason why we do what we do, why our leaders rule the nation in a certain way, as opposed to some of these French revolutionary ideals that have been forced or foisted upon our nation. It's very important also in encouraging our elected officials to think of their role and duty, not just in light of the people who are electing them, but in light of the laws that have been written up for our nation, in light of eternal principles for law, in light of protecting the people of our nation from the abuses that happen when the majority want to devour the minority. This is something that Ben Franklin reflected on at the time of the American Revolution. He wanted to protect people from that danger. He drew the analogy of 3 wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. Well, if you have 75% vote to eat the 25%, you can't do much about that. Unless there is a law, a higher law that protects the rights and freedoms of the minority as well. Think about babies who are being aborted in the womb. Their rights, even though they're a minority, even though they cannot speak for themselves, their rights also have to be protected underneath the rule of Canadian law. Because if they can't speak for themselves, well, then who's going to speak for them? Well, that's the whole point of having a constitutional law that is even above the authorities of the land, so that the weakest, those who cannot speak for themselves, will be protected. This is all very important stuff, and I want to talk a little bit more about Groen van Prinsterer as well. He writes a book called Unbelief and Revolution, and in that book he reflects on the French Revolution and how the French Revolution diverged from principles for Western law, and how that led to the great and enormous abuses of the French Revolution. They basically rejected the constitutional foundations for Western law and decided it based on the will of the people. Van Prinsterer's central thesis in that book, Van Prinsterer is writing in the mid-1800s. He's a politician and a theologian in the Netherlands. And his central principle for that, thesis for that book is that the French Revolution arose because of unbelief. Because of unbelief that was at the heart or at the center of that nation. And it's that principle of unbelief that affects our nation today as well. If you think about secularism, the idea that a nation can be secular, that it can reject religion, that it can reject the rule of Christ, the supremacy of God, that's a very dangerous direction to head in. First of all, because secularism is inherently religious, because we all are inherently religious. But it also makes either the will of the majority or the state the highest authority in society. So you get modern day statism. Fundamentally, when a country heads in that direction of human rights abuses, it begins because we have rejected God. It begins due to unbelief in society. It's interesting that Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he probably never read Van Prinsterer. I don't know how he would have gotten his hands on the book. But he comes to the same conclusion about the communistic and atheistic governments of Russia. Why did all these things happen, he says in one of his writings? Well, it's because men have forgotten God. He also refers back to the whole principle of the French Revolution and the dangers. Think of Nazi Germany, where the state is the highest authority. It happens when people forget God, when they reject God and His Word, and the state becomes a higher authority than the Word of God. These are all very important things to reflect on as we reflect on our nation and what's happening in our nation. Anyway, those are just a few thoughts for the day. It's something worth thinking about. It's something worth researching into. So I would encourage you to buy the book Unbelief and Revolution by Groen van Prinsterer. I would encourage you to buy the book Lex Rex by Samuel Rutherford. These are all good things to be researching and thinking about, reflecting on how to communicate within our society. But fundamentally at root, what our society needs the most is revival and reformation. We need a society of people repenting of their sins, turning to God, seeking and pursuing the good of the church in this nation, and seeking the headship, honoring the headship of Christ within his church. Because it's only by these means that our nation really will begin to return back, to take an about turn, a course back to this authority of God over all. If we continue to reject him, if we continue to forget him, then these things will continue to happen.